Earthquakes can be planned for. You stock up on food, water, and batteries, and retrofit your home or building to minimize damage. Avalanches are a bit trickier. You hope that the local disaster prevention authorities did their job, like trigger smaller avalanches before they can build up to become potentially large avalanches, or set up a warning system to let people in the area know when an avalanche is coming. However, for the residents of Ancash in Peru in 1970, they had very little warning. The quake came suddenly in the middle of the day. A monstrous slab of ice fell without warning onto a massive glacier formation. In seconds, a raging river of 50 million cubic meters of ice and rock was crashing towards their villages at 200 miles per hour. Those people had only 2 or at most 3 minutes to run as fast as they could to the highest ground. It was a good time to have your wits about you.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleton. Today's episode is about one of the worst avalanches in recorded history, and one of the deadliest earthquakes to hit South America. Close to 50 years ago, a major earthquake struck off the coast of Peru near the coastal city of Chimbote. The long, rumbling earthquake brought down buildings and homes, creating fissures in the ground, and causing debris from structures to rain down on Peruvians who were fleeing the terror indoors to the perceived safety of outdoors. But perhaps the most devastating part of the earthquake was the giant slab of glacial ice that was loosened during the shaking on high up Mount Huascaran. An enormous chunk of solid ice fell onto a glacial deposit below, loosening the ice and rock and sending a titanic river of debris cascading into the Santa Rio Valley and over the densely populated towns of Yungay and Ranrahirca, killing almost all of the people in these areas except for a few survivors who made it to high ground or safely out of the danger area. But the avalanche wasn't a complete surprise. The Santa Rio Valley had numerous avalanches before, including one that killed as many as 4,000 people just 8 years earlier. Avalanches, sometimes referred to as snow slides or snow slips, are rapid flows of snow moving downslope along mountainsides. Avalanches always involve the movement of snow, whereas landslides always involve the sides of hills or mountains giving away and falling onto the terrain below. An avalanche is usually triggered by a failure in the snowpack when forces pressing on the snowpack are greater than the forces holding the snowpack in place. Common causes of avalanches are extreme rainfall, snowfall, wind, rock falls, ice falls, solar radiation leading to rapid melting, man-made intervention, either intentional or unintentional, and earthquakes. However, shouting or any kind of noise will not set off an avalanche, no matter what you have seen in cartoons. One of the most interesting attributes of avalanches is that once started, they tend to grow larger and move faster as the slide continues downhill. Snow, rock, and other debris will collide with and entrain more snow, rock, and debris, increasing the volume of the avalanche, and this mass will accelerate as it slides downward in a giant flurry of a moving snow cloud. It is not unusual for an avalanche to reach a mass of more than 10 million tons and speeds greater than 200 miles per hour or 320 kilometers per hour. In rare instances, avalanches of this size have been known to hit populated areas, completely wiping the towns and their inhabitants off the map. The worst case of a mass-scale avalanche hitting a populated area happened in the area of Ancash in Peru. On the day of May 31st, 1970, while most of the world, including Peru, was watching the World Cup final between Italy and Brazil, a major earthquake struck just 25 kilometers off the coast near the town of Chimbote. In a fortunate sense, the earthquake struck at a depth of 40 kilometers or 25 miles beneath the ocean floor, and for that reason, the only tsunami that occurred was measured at just 1 foot. However, the quake itself was extremely powerful, measuring 7.9 on the Richter scale. Most eyewitnesses reported the quake shook for as long as 45 seconds, which would feel like a blink of an eye if you are waiting for a bus, but can feel like an eternity when the walls around you are swaying, objects are being thrown off shelves, glass and mirrors are breaking, support beams are collapsing, and brick buildings are tumbling down like children's blocks. The quake came without warning. There were no pre-tremors. The ground shook from side to side, making walking nearly impossible. Buildings shook, houses crumbled, and people with no safe place to run to were crushed beneath falling debris. The earthquake affected an area of about 83,000 square kilometers, or an area that is larger than Belgium and the Netherlands combined. Brick buildings and unreinforced structures collapsed. The many adobe or mud brick homes in the affected region caved in. It was a system-wide disaster, impacting such a widespread area that the regional infrastructure of communications, commerce, and transportation was destroyed. Economic losses surpassed $500 million. Cities, towns, villages, as well as the homes, industries, public buildings, schools, water, sanitary, and communications facilities inside the towns were seriously damaged or destroyed. In Chimbote, Carhizes, and Rekuye, about 80 to 90% of buildings were destroyed, affecting about 3 million people. The destruction of roads and railways left many towns isolated for months. The Pan American Highway was also damaged, which made the arrival of humanitarian aid difficult. The Canon del Pato hydroelectricity generator was damaged by the quake caused by the flooding of the Santa Rio, and the railway connecting Chimbote with the Santa Valley was left unstable on 60% of its route. It is estimated that 70,000 people died in the earthquake, and another 50,000 were injured. 200,000 homes and buildings were destroyed, and more than 800,000 people were left homeless. The quake also triggered numerous landslides in an area that has a long history of such landslides. These landslides also contributed to cutting off remote areas, and it would be months before rescue teams could reach people in there, and the full extent of the damage could be surveyed. But the single most devastating event was the large debris avalanche that originated from the north peak of Nevado Huascarán, falling 12,000 feet and traveling 7 miles in as little as 3 to 4 minutes. The debris flow from the avalanche, consisting of ice, snow, mud, and rock, leveled the towns of Yungay and Ranrahirka in the Santa Ria Valley at the basin below the mountain. As many as 18,000 people were buried beneath this debris flow. This avalanche, in terms of destructiveness, height of fall, and probably volume, far exceeds any avalanche on record. Japanese mountain climber Kiichi Takahashi, who was camped opposite the north peak at the time of the earthquake, witnessed a rim of ice about 20 by 30 by 500 meters breaking off the edge of the northern peak of Mount Huascarán, located more than 75 miles east of the Pacific coast. Takahashi said the mass of ice fell about 1,000 meters down the cliff and landed directly on top of a large glacier, initiating the avalanche. Huascarán, at 22,000 feet high, is the fourth highest mountain in South America, and part of the Andes range of mountains. It is taller than Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley in Alaska, taller than Mount Elbrus in Europe, and taller than Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. It is situated in the Cordillera Blanca range, so named for the color of its glacier-capped peaks, which rises above the Santa Rio Valley, and is just opposite the Cordillera Negra, or the Black Peaks, made of granite. The southern summit of Mount Huascarán is the highest point in Peru, but also the tallest mountain in Earth's tropics. The existence of such a high peak in such a warm part of the world may contribute to the many avalanches recorded in this area. The massive slab of ice that Takahashi witnessed falling completely airborne landed on a formation known as Glacier 511. When that slab hit the glacier, it dislodged and entrained an enormous amount of rock and ice estimated to be as much as 50 to 100 million cubic meters, or enough debris to fill Wembley Stadium 50 to 100 times over. Within seconds, the debris flow had traversed a slope of 2.5 kilometers with a 1 kilometer drop in elevation. That is a 22-degree grade at its steepest point. For the next 9 miles or 15 kilometers, the debris flow encountered no major formations to block its path and achieved a speed of about 200 miles per hour, or 325 kilometers per hour. That's about the top-end speed of a Lamborghini Gallardo. The flow cascaded into the Languanuco Valley, where it was confined within the deep, narrow Languanuco Canyon, sloshing from side to side like a bobsled. Just before it entered the Santa Ria Valley, the debris flow jumped over a 700-foot-high ridge, hardly slowing down at all. At that point, the flow split into 2 channels, with the larger portion flowing directly into the village of Ranrahirka, and the smaller channel going toward Yungay. The section that hit Yungay managed to get airborne as it was propelled over the ridge. Then it slammed into Yungay. When I first saw the pictures taken after the event, I thought the debris flow had cleared everything out of Yungay. Then I realized the entire town had been buried under mud. The part of town closest to the mountains was covered with 30 to 40 feet of mud, rock, ice, and giant boulders. Away from the mountain, it was as high as 10 feet. Some of the boulders were as large as 7,000 tons. There's a picture of the central plaza of the town taken before the avalanche. The plaza is busy with townsfolk conversing and going about their business. The main plaza is hemmed in by 2- and 3-story adobe and stucco buildings. Cars and trucks are parked there, and in the center of the plaza are 4 large palm trees. In the picture taken after the avalanche, all that can be seen are the 4 palm trees, about the only objects left standing after the disaster, now half as tall after being buried up to 20 feet in mud. The avalanche flow continued uninhibited for 25 kilometers, or 15 miles, until it finally hit the Santa River and flattened out. The avalanche killed as many as 25,000 to 30,000 people in the town of Yungay and the village of Ranrahirka and the surrounding areas. Of Yungay's original population of 25,000, only 300 people survived. The survivors fell into mostly just 2 groups. Those people fortunate enough to be at the cemetery, crowned by a tall mound when the quake first struck, and a group of about 200 children who were being entertained by a circus in the local sports arena on the edge of town. The debris flow passed within just a few feet of the grandstand where the children were sitting. Within a few minutes, the children and the circus performers witnessed the destruction of almost everything around them. The clown led the children to safety like the Pied Piper, Henry Gomez, a local tourist guide, told the Peruvian Times. As soon as the earthquake struck, he led them from his tent to higher ground. On that day, the clowns were the good guys. A team of 15 mountain climbers from Czechoslovakia were camped out at the base of the mountain when they were engulfed by a stream from the avalanche flow. The most detailed eyewitness account of what happened that day came from Mateo Casaverde, a geophysicist with the Institute of Geophysics in Peru. Casaverde was spending the day acting as tour guide to a French couple who were friends of his. They had just finished photographing Mount Huascarán and had driven to the cemetery hill when the earthquake struck. Here are Mr. Casaverde's own words about that day. It was a Sunday afternoon on May 31st, 1970. I was in Yungay taking friends on a tour of this area. At about 3 p.m., we stopped to take photographs of Nevado Huascarán. We photographed Huascarán through a telephoto lens, and at the time commented about the prominent cracks in the glacier near the summit at the North Peak. We talked about the danger of ice avalanches. We then drove the car along the main road between Yungay and Ranrahirka in a southerly direction through Yungay. As we drove past the cemetery, which is situated on a hill, the car began to shake. The car rocked, and my first impression was that something was mechanically wrong with the car. It was not until I had stopped the car that I realized we were experiencing an earthquake. We immediately got out of the car and observed the effects of the earthquake around us. I saw several homes as well as the small bridge crossing the creek near Cemetery Hill collapse. My first thoughts were reflected back to remembering past destructive debris and mud flows that have occurred in this region as a result of the bursting morainal or glacial dams in the upper valleys. It was, I suppose, after about 1/2 to 3/4 of a minute when the earthquake shaking began to subside. At that time I heard a great roar coming from Huskvarna. In looking up, I saw what appeared to be a cloud of dust, and it looked as though a large mass of rock and ice was breaking loose from the north peak. My immediate reaction was to run for the high ground of Cemetery Hill, situated about 150 to 200 meters away. I began running and noticed there were many others in Yungay that were also running towards Cemetery Hill. About 1/2 to 3/4 of the way up the hill, the wife of my friend stumbled and fell, and I turned to help her back to her feet. At that time, the debris avalanche had reached the point above Yungay where a ridge separates Yungay from the Languanuco stream channel. The crest of the wave had a curl like a huge breaker coming in off the ocean. I estimated the wave to be at 80 meters high or 250 feet. At that time, I observed literally hundreds of people in Yungay running in all directions, and many toward the high ground at Cemetery Hill. I continued to run toward the top of the hill and was almost there when I felt a strong, turbulent blast of wind. All the while, there was a continuous loud roar and rumble. I reached the upper level of the cemetery near the top just as the debris flow struck the base of the hill, and I was probably only about 10 seconds ahead of it. At about the same time, I saw a man just a few meters downhill carrying 2 small children toward the hilltop. The debris flow caught him, and he threw the 2 children toward the hilltop, out of the path of the flow to safety, although the debris flow swept him down the valley, never to be seen again. I also remember 2 women who were no more than a few meters behind me, and I never did see them again. I saw a man who was caught in the mud flow, but was able to struggle out, and he looked like a monster covered with thick brown mud. In looking around, I counted 92 persons who had also saved themselves by running to the top of the hill. Most of these were teenagers who were more agile and able to run. Apparently the older, the disabled, and the very young could not run fast enough to escape. It was the most horrible thing I have ever experienced, and I will never forget it. The 1970 avalanche at Huskvarna was devastating and catastrophic, but it wasn't without precedents. Just 8 years earlier, on January 8, 1962, the Ranrahirka area was engulfed by an avalanche that also originated from the same part of the north peak of Huskvarna. On that evening, as most of the region's people gathered in their homes for dinner, the edge of a giant glacier suddenly broke apart and thundered down the mountain. The block of ice was the size of 2 skyscrapers and weighed approximately 6 million tons, and like the 1970 event, it made a loud noise as it fell, which was heard in the towns below. As avalanches were not unusual in the area, it was common knowledge that there was usually a 20 to 30-minute gap between the sound of the ice cracking off and an avalanche, which gave people time to seek higher ground. However, this time the avalanche traveled 9.5 miles in only 7 minutes, wiping away several communities. The towns of Ranrahirka and Huarskucho were buried under 40 feet of ice, mud, trees, boulders, and other debris. Only a handful of people in each town survived. The avalanche finally ended at the Santa River, where it stopped the water flow, causing flooding in the nearby areas. The Santa River rose by 8 meters, or 26 feet, carrying with it everything in its path down the Rio Santa Valley. According to accounts at the time, the 1962 avalanche contained an estimated 2.3 to 3 million cubic meters of ice and rock. It destroyed 9 small towns, including most of Ranrahirka, killing an estimated 4,000 people. Some bodies were carried all the way to the Pacific Ocean near Chimbote, 100 miles away. Others were buried under so much debris that their bodies were never recovered. An additional 10,000 farm animals were killed, and millions of dollars in crops were destroyed. Unlike 1970, the 1962 event was not triggered by an earthquake, but more likely by a snowstorm that was pounding the mountain range. That avalanche was more confined in the area that was affected, although it did come close to overrunning the ridge that the 1970 avalanche topped over. In the 8 years following the 1962 avalanche, approximately 2,500 people returned to the area and rebuilt Ranrahirka and the neighboring villages. The 1970 avalanche again destroyed those villages and almost all of its inhabitants. Today, Yungay is a national cemetery, and the Husqvarna's victims are still vividly remembered. Because the Peruvian government has forbidden excavation in the area, crosses and tombs mark the spots where homes once stood, engraved with the names of those never found. To this day, a crushed inner-city bus, the four of the original palm trees that once crowned the city's main plaza, and remnants of the cathedral still stand. Also left standing was the tall statue of Jesus, arms extended, open in a broad gesture at the top of Cemetery Hill. The statue's appearance at the time must have seemed like a heavenly miracle, the Savior, welcoming the fleeing victims of the avalanche out of harm's way. Since that time, a new Yungay was rebuilt, a few kilometers away from the original city. Peru does not want to forget. In 2000, in memory of the victims of the deadliest seismic disaster in the history of Latin America, the government declared May 31st Natural Disaster Education and Reflection Day. In an article written by Lloyd S. Clough, Director of Earthquake Risk Management for the Pacific Gas and Electric Company of California, for the Bulletin for the Seismological Society of America in June 1971, Clough concluded, "The single most devastating event associated with the May 31st, 1970 earthquake was the Husqvarna debris avalanche. Field evidence strongly suggests that the areas of Yungay and Ranrahirka have been repeatedly covered by earlier debris avalanches, some of which have been larger in extent than the May 1970 event. In addition to the avalanche, literally thousands of landslides, soil failures, mud flows, and rock falls occurred at epicentral distances as great as 100 miles. Damage resulting from vibrational effects was severe throughout a major part of the affected region. The most intense vibrational damage resulted from poor adobe construction. Well-constructed, reinforced houses and buildings showed only minor damage. There was no evidence of tectonic warping or shifting of the land due to earthquakes. However, an important active fault zone exists at the west front of the Cordillera Blanca, and although it did not move during the May 31st earthquake, it should be considered as a zone of potential earthquake activity. In analyzing the 1970 Ancash earthquake, we can say that there is little that can be done to prevent or minimize earthquakes. The forces at work are so vast it is beyond our current technology to stop earthquakes at their point of origin. However, we can minimize the damage due to earthquakes and avalanches triggered by earthquakes. At ski resorts in particular, and mountain regions in developed nations in general, actions such as human-controlled avalanches through the use of explosives can confine avalanches to safe times and locations. These types of preventive actions can be taken in areas where avalanches have a history of threatening populations. The Andean mountain range, with its high peaks and close proximity to the Pacific Ocean, where storms can drop several feet of snow at a time, has a long history of dangerous avalanches. In the wake of the 4,000 people that died in the 1962 event, more could have been done by the Peruvian government to prevent resettlement of the hazardous area. In regards to earthquakes, time and again we've seen that residences built of solid modern materials will outlast at a much higher percentage residences built of softer, older technology materials such as adobe brick. The incorporation of elastic materials in building foundations allows for more vibrations during earthquakes and minimizes damage. As for construction materials, wood and steel have greater flexibility than stucco, unreinforced concrete, or masonry. Reinforced beams and trusses can also help prevent warping and collapse of buildings and structures during and after an earthquake. Softer soils and surrounding earth that contains a high amount of moisture are more prone to induce greater amounts of structural damage during an earthquake. That is partly due to the properties of resonance as energy passes through the soil during the shocks of the quake. Providing additional solid breaks in the soil surrounding the foundation and building on solid earth such as bedrock greatly reduces the likelihood of large amounts of damage to structures and buildings. I witnessed this firsthand during the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989. The soft, semi-liquid landfill used in the Marina district of San Francisco experienced the most structural damage in the city, whereas the solid bedrock, where the University of San Francisco is located, suffered only minor structural damage. We've recently witnessed the effects of a major earthquake on unreinforced structures in central Italy this year, and most recently this week. Many of the collapsed buildings were slated for retrofitting by local governments, but graft and corruption prevented the planned renovations from taking place. Hundreds of people died in the Akumali earthquake on August 24th. How many could have been saved by earthquake retrofitting prior to the tremor, we'll never know. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. I don't ask for your help often, but I'm going to this time. If you use iTunes to get to your podcasts, please go into iTunes and rate the show. Or whatever method you use, please go to that site and rate the show or do what you can to get word of the show out. Every rating the show receives increases the opportunity on iTunes. It will appear in more searches. Also, I don't ask for money often because this is not an expensive show to produce, but it does have some costs including domain names, web hosting, podcast hosting, and the occasional needed equipment upgrades. All that you need to do is to go onto the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com and click on the beautiful, shiny, gleaming, gold-colored donate button. Every little bit helps. Don't forget that I am part of the Dark Myths Association of Podcasters, which includes such awesome podcasts as History on Fire, Eastern Borders, Our Fake History, Expanded Perspectives, Iroquois History and Legends, Brutal Ends, Twilight Histories, and Night Fears. For more information, go to darkmyths.org. Our next episode will examine heat waves that struck Europe and Russia recently. In 2003, the worst heat wave to hit the continent in 500 years stuck around for 2 months and was responsible for killing more than 70,000 people. Many of those deaths could have been prevented just by educating the populace on how to deal with extreme heat. In 2010, an unprecedented heat wave in Russia, starting as early as May, contributed to massive wildfires that socked in Moscow in a shroud of smoke and smog that was responsible for killing more than 55,000 people. And Russia wasn't the only place to get hit that year. Are we looking at our new normal? Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.